Hi, my name is Clarissa Humphreys, and I'm the co-author of the book Addressing Student Sexual Violence in Higher Education, A Good Practice Guide, and I'm also the Sexual Misconduct Prevention and Response Manager at Durham University. So when we're thinking about trauma-informed responses, we firstly need to recognize that anytime someone is subjected to any form of unwanted behavior, whether this is sexual harassment, sexual violence, general harassment, bullying, or discrimination, this experience can be traumatic for that person. Trauma is an experience that overwhelms a person's ability to cope. And so something that one person might brush off and think, oh, that's not a big deal, I didn't like it, but oh well, could be life-changing for the next person. And so it's really important that case management responses are always trauma-informed, because as case managers and as university employees, it's not for us to determine whether or not something should or shouldn't have been traumatic, but to recognize that it could have been for that individual. And so there are many ways that we can promote a trauma-informed approach to our case management processes. And for the sake of time, I'll give a couple of examples. This isn't an exhaustive list, but these are some good ways to start. University staff need to understand the impact of trauma on the short-term and long-term functioning of the person subjected to harassment. And so we want to think about how the person would have responded during an incident of unwanted behavior based from a trauma-informed lens. We want to understand how their memories of that incident were created during the incident based on trauma, and also how they might be able to retrieve those memories or not be able to retrieve those memories because of the trauma they experienced. And we want to also understand how they might be acting now. And so from a trauma-informed lens, we're going to recognize there's going to be a range of presentations and behaviors that for us might seem a bit counterintuitive, but when we understand how trauma impacts a person, it makes more sense. And so that helps us when we're working with those individuals. Second, a trauma-informed approach will always promote physical and emotional safety. And so for a case management approach, this can be done by training staff on how to respond appropriately to disclosures, how to implement proportionate precautionary measures for the safety of the individual who's subjected to that unwanted behavior, and how to risk assess the situation to understand what potential harm could continue to happen during an investigation. And if a university or if the police actually investigate the situation and is found that misconduct did occur, then universities, if we want to be trauma-informed, we actually have to hold perpetrators accountable for their actions in order to demonstrate that harassment is not tolerated within our institution, in order to promote physical and emotional safety for an entire community. Third, a trauma-informed approach will also promote transparency in order to build trust between the community and the institution, as well as the individuals impacted by those unwanted behaviors. And so that can look like a lot of different things, but number one, keeping people informed about what's happening throughout the process and letting them know the outcome as well. Finally, the trauma-informed approach can also focus on not re-traumatizing victim survivors, and it should empower victim survivors to choose how to take forward a disclosure. So to give you two examples of how you can do this, the first would be to minimize the number of times a victim survivor has to share their story. So in the procedure and how it is actually created, how you train your staff, what you want to ensure is that if someone discloses something happened to them, that they don't have to retell that story over and over and over again. They should be able to make that first disclosure and then maybe say it to one other person who might be investigating the situation, but hopefully not even more than 3 times. And so how we build our procedures, we want to ensure that we're protecting people from having to reopen that wound over and over again so that we're not causing them more trauma. We also want to, in our response to a disclosure, provide non-directive signposting to report and support options so that that person can choose what to do next, to empower them to be back in control of the situation rather than trying to take control away from them and decide for them. So we need to clearly communicate the process victim survivors can expect when reporting harassment for multiple reasons. This is a part of a comprehensive institution-wide approach, which includes being trauma-informed, survivor-centered, human rights and social justice-based, to be intersectional, as well as to have perpetrator accountability. This is a key part of that comprehensive wide approach. When we communicate the process to victim survivors, it's not even just when something happens and when they come forward. This is beforehand. This is having that information available to students and staff across the institution in a way that it's accessible for anyone, so they're able to understand if something happens, they know where to go and what will happen. So when we communicate the process, this reduces barriers to disclosure and reporting, and it can empower a victim survivor to actually decide to make a report. Often victim survivors don't know how to report, who to report to, and most importantly, what will happen if they do report. And that's not good. We want them to know those things ahead of time before anything actually happens. But if it does happen, that they're able to know that, because they're going to be distressed, they're going to want to be able to access that information easily in your institution. So by clearly outlining each step of the process, a victim survivor is able to make an informed decision about whether or not reporting is right for them. Doing this also helps manage expectations for the victim survivor. There are a lot of limits to what a university can do, and so it's actually really important to clarify at the start of a process what's within the scope of the university's procedure, all the way from the beginning, from disclosing an incident of unwanted behavior through to the end of a discipline process, so that a victim survivor knows what to expect, so that they're more prepared, so that there are no surprises. And finally, by clearly communicating the process, it actually makes it fair for all parties involved. It ensures that a procedure is followed, and it allows individuals involved the assurance that they are going to be given a fair and transparent process. Oftentimes, the grounds to request a review or appeal an outcome of an investigation includes failure to follow a procedure or a procedural irregularity that has or potentially had an impact on the outcome. And so if the procedure is written vaguely, or if it's not properly communicated to the students or staff involved, then individuals may not even recognize that they have a right to an appeal. And without appeals as an institution, it's very difficult for us to test the integrity of our policy. And it's very difficult for us to understand when we have got something wrong and to learn lessons from that. So not only does clearly communicating the process help our victim survivors in being able to make a decision about reporting, in breaking down those barriers to disclosures, in managing expectations, but it makes it fair for everyone, and it helps us as an institution ensure our procedures are working properly. My view is that the reporting party and the responding party should be informed of the outcome of an investigation, and where disciplinary action is taken, it is also appropriate to share the sanctions imposed with the reporting party. We see this tested out in other university contexts internationally. For example, in the United States, which has been working in this area for a much longer time, decades before the UK began to look at this in the university sector. We found that in the United States, this is actually a legal requirement for cases that involve sexual violence, that both the reporting party and responding party are given the full and final outcome and sanctions of a case. In the UK, there's unfortunately no legal requirement that can guide us to share or not share the outcome and sanctions, but rather we are guided by the General Data Protection Regulations, or GDPR, the Human Rights Act, as well as the Equalities Act, on deciding what is appropriate to share with each party. So in other words, there's nothing that says you can't share or you have to share these outcomes in the university context, but rather we have to use the principles that are built into these legal frameworks to understand when can we share and what is appropriate to share with each individual. So by sharing the outcome with both parties, we help to ensure that the reporting party is able to continue with their studies safely, which is important in relation to ensuring that reporting parties have equal and fair access to education. Where universities decide not to share the outcomes of an investigation with the reporting party, I would ask them, how are they demonstrating that they have remedied the harm caused? How have they ensured the reporting party feels safe to continue with their studies in order to allow them equal access to education? University discipline processes are traditionally set up for academic misconduct. If we think about how those procedures were originally developed. So thinking about where a student has committed some form of misconduct against the institution through, for example, plagiarism or cheating. But in harassment cases, there are two parties, and the human rights and the equality rights of both parties have to be managed. In both civil and criminal court, the complainant or the injured party would always be informed of the full outcome of the case. As the discipline process is about the reporting party's experience and the harm that was caused to them, and their data, as well as the responding party's data, will have been viewed in that discipline process, they should be able to know the outcome of any decision made. In addition, universities have the ability to share anonymized information about investigation and discipline outcomes more widely within the university community, so that they can demonstrate to the community that the policy is more than just a piece of paper, but rather it's an active policy that is enforced. We want to ensure that for our students and staff that they recognize that when we say that this form of behavior is not okay in our community, that we're actually going to respond if it happens, that there will be a consequence, and that we won't tolerate that behavior in this space. So this will help with prevention by creating a deterrent for would-be perpetrators so that they will think twice before doing something, because they know, oh, actually, the university has shown me that they will take discipline action against someone, that there are consequences here. And so that can prevent perpetrators from acting in that way. But also, most importantly, it will help build trust between students in the institution as well as staff in the institution, to show that the institution is protecting the safety of everyone in their community, and that they will take action if someone tries to make that space unsafe for those of us in the community. So when we're responding to harassment reported or disclosed in the university, there are potentially a number of different staff who are going to be involved in that process at different points. And it's really important that each and every one of those individuals has the adequate training in order to be involved in the process appropriately. And so depending on the type of harassment that's being considered, all staff involved should have a general awareness and understanding of that form of harassment. So for example, if we're talking about sexual misconduct and violence, every single staff member who's going to be involved, particularly in any decision-making or any delivery of support, should be trained to have awareness of sexual misconduct and violence, so that they understand the impact of sexual violence, that they understand the prevalence, they understand the risks of this, but also that they've done some training to debunk any myths that they might have previously thought about in relation to this area. In the same way, we would want to see that general understanding if it was in relation to any kind of bullying and harassment, any form of discrimination, that staff have engaged in that work. And this might even include some levels of unconscious bias training as well. And so that's kind of the foundation, the basis. But then from there, what we want to see is that whoever is receiving the disclosure of that unwanted behavior is trained appropriately to respond to disclosures, that they have trauma-informed training on responding to disclosures in that area. Then when we see someone who's maybe managing that case, that they're able to appropriately communicate the policy and procedures that are going to be followed to that individual, and that they're able to understand the impact that these behaviors can have on a person, to be able to understand how that person might engage with them, and to always be reactive to any support needs that might come up for that individual. Those who might be investigating need to be trained to conduct trauma-informed investigations into the relevant form of harassment. I always say to investigators, for example, if I was asked to investigate tax fraud, although I have investigation skills in my background, I don't know tax law and I don't know about fraud, so I wouldn't be appropriate to investigate a tax fraud case. In the same way, if we're asking people to investigate sexual misconduct, harassment, discrimination, they need to have an understanding in these areas in order to investigate them well, so it's fair for all parties involved. For those who are making decisions around adjudication, making decisions, did misconduct happen, yes or no? For those who are making decisions around sanctioning, what is the appropriate sanction to be held in this case? Again, they need to be trained appropriately. And so to kind of summarize that, we'd want to see people trained in awareness of the forms of harassment that they're dealing with. We'd want them trained in responding to disclosures. We'd want our case managers trained in assessing risk and providing the appropriate precautionary measures and support. We'd want our investigators trained in trauma-informed investigation techniques, and our adjudicators and those who are making decisions around any sanctions trained up appropriately to do those jobs, including how to apply the civil standard of proof, for example. And so that seems like a lot to ask people to go and do, but actually, if we want to do this well, if we want to ensure that our decisions are appropriate and that they hold up to appeals and that we are making decisions that for the safety of our community, we want to equip our staff to be able to manage these cases well. And that not only helps the community, it helps the individuals involved in those cases, and it helps those employees who are being asked to do those really big jobs that can be very challenging to ensure that they're doing it well and that they're kept safe too. So whenever we're working with anyone involved in an investigation process or discipline process in a university, we want to ensure that those parties have the appropriate support available to them. And so that means that the reporting party has support and the responding party has support. And by support, it's a holistic support. So it's not just academic support, but we want to look at what are their mental health, physical health needs. Are there any kind of general well-being concerns? Is there anything in relation to their financial situation, housing and accommodation? And so whenever we're beginning a process, what we want to be thinking about is, before we even enter into that investigation, firstly, what support needs do both parties have? How can we ensure that they can engage in this process, be supported to do so? And then what is the potential risk that, if the allegation were to be true, what risk is presented there for future continued harm to any of the parties involved or anybody else in the university community? How might we mitigate that risk? And so there's a couple of pieces there that we want to do to set that support up appropriately. So we want to hear from the students involved to know what support needs they have. We want to make sure that we're checking in with other parts of the university who might know more things about the students. So potentially your student support or counseling departments, your disability support departments, anything that the departments might know around the support needs of these individuals. But doing so in a way that maintains their confidentiality. So you're not sharing the details of why we need that information, but we're gathering that information to make sure that we aren't missing anything. And then we're actually assigning someone to go to be that person's support contact throughout the process. And we're separating out that support. So no one person should be supporting both parties during an investigation. They should have separate people in the university they can go to seek support from. And then for some types of harassment and unwanted behavior, you might even have specialist support available. So for example, if we're talking about someone who's been subjected to some form of sexual violence or gender-based violence, we might have them with specialist counselors for sexual violence or domestic abuse or stalking. And we want to make sure that we're not only offering support internally within the university, but we also want to partner with external organizations who are the specialists, who know how to appropriately support these individuals in those particular areas, to make sure that they have that level of support as well as what we can offer normally in the institution. And then what we would see is, through that process, the support person alongside with the case managers always communicating to those individuals what's happening. And if support needs change, or if risk level changes, that we're responding and we're being reactive to those things to make sure that we're adjusting things as we go along. Particularly if there are significant changes in the situation or in the case, that means that risk is greatened or that risk is lessened, or that maybe say the term ended and now everyone's gone home and something shifted. And so we need to make sure those support needs are still met.